We're recording this, by the way. I don't know if we're going to do anything with it. We might edit it down. So if you don't want to be in something that might end up on YouTube, you can turn off your videos if you choose. There, Desmond's gone. Not you, Des. You have to have your video on.
Thought I was going to get away with that, actually.
No, I saw it right away. Okay, my mom just joined, so I think we're probably ready to go. All right, amazing. So I'll try and keep my eyes on the chat. My name is Dave. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. The numbers continue to grow. This is really exciting. This is part of a speaker series we're going to be having throughout the year on Mondays at 7 o'clock Eastern. I apologize to those on the West Coast who it's 4 o'clock, you're still at work. We really try to find a time that would work best for everyone, coast to coast, and we settled on this one. We have an amazing lineup of guests from all across the political spectrum, different backgrounds, different professions, different lived experiences, but all part of what I consider to be a movement for democratic reform, in the sense of reimagining what power looks like, who has power, who currently doesn't have power, how we share power, how we shift power, what power feels, sounds, and looks like. And what is the point of all these systems in the first place? And to what degree is it time to upgrade the operating systems that so many of our institutions have been running on for a very long time? Desmond Cole is our first guest of this series. Me and Des have known each other for, I don't know, about 15 years. Activists tend to cross paths frequently. I'm really excited to have Des with us. I really want to encourage everyone to have a copy of this in their home and be familiar with it. This is Des's book, The Skin We're In. It is an incredible piece of work, and you really should read it. It's beautifully written. It explains things in a very poetic and informative and historical context as well. So Des is really good at sorry, Des, I'm just gonna say nice things about you for a minute and you can just sit there awkwardly. It's like a history crash course. He goes far beyond just the lived experience of a Black man, but also
You somehow became muted, Des, just a second ago. This is what happens when you go on too long complimenting me.
That's good. Did you do it? Anyways, the book also goes into Indigenous marginalization and LGBTQ issues. And Desmond really creatively connects the dots between injustices happening now, and shows how it's just another shape of something that's been happening all along. And that some of the core issues of the dominant culture pushing out other voices has always been there. And it's just really mind-opening. And it's just an amazing book. I reread the whole thing this week for the second time, and it reminded me what a powerful and great writer Des is. I have a few questions for Des, but I also want to keep my eye on the chat. Thank you. I think this is great. So there's been a whole bunch of land acknowledgements in the chat. I appreciate that. Wow, where do we start? Des, I have questions for you about activism. I think you have a really unique brand of activism. I know you don't always like the word activist. I don't either, but let's just use it for purposes tonight. Questions about theories of change. I have some questions about the book, so you as an author. And then I want to talk about some specific reforms that interest me and my board. And I want to get some feedback from you and also hear what reforms you're interested in these days. And then I'm going to ask you what everyone who's watching can do to support the work that motivates you, how we can be allies and supporters of your various endeavors and projects and passions. Does that sound cool as a general framework for the evening?
Absolutely.
Sweet. Okay. And I'm going to ask Manvi, can you just keep track of the chat and maybe just, I don't know, isolate the questions that excite you and then maybe send them to me as a kind of a DM in case I'm not able to follow the whole chat while I'm talking with Des?
Sure, that sounds good.
Amazing. Thank you. So my first question about the book, Des, and by the way, feel free to just go off on a tangent about whatever you want. I'm prompting you, but you don't need prompting.
You know, that's all I do anyway, so.
The degree to which you address Indigenous and LGBT issues and their histories and connect the dots, I found really helpful, but I'm curious how that came to you, like as a Black man writing a book that has the word Black resistance in the cover. What motivated and inspired you to tie your resistance into the resistance of other communities in such a prominent way?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Mez. Thanks to Unlock Democracy for this event. Thank you for everybody who's here. You were talking about land acknowledgements, so I will say I am, as you are this evening, I think, we are in Treaty 13, which is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas, of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. And I can kind of go into the first question by saying that when we do land acknowledgements as one thing that we didn't used to do very often in this country, and which has become a more common thing in some circles, we want it to mean something. So we don't want to just do it performatively. So in the same way, me being born in Canada, so-called Canada, and benefiting from the theft of other people's traditional territory, of course, in my book, I had to talk about that and about what it means relative to what I see as being my own struggles. But it's even more complicated than that, because of course, there are Black people who also have Indigenous ancestry to this part of what's sometimes called Turtle Island, right? It's not one or the other. It's not like Black people looking in at Indigenous people's struggles and being like, wow, what's going on over there? There is an intermixing. And even if you look at, we like to talk, as I mentioned in the book, about the Underground Railroad as being this kind of origin story for Black people coming to Canada, which is not true. Black people were coming here for hundreds of years before that as enslaved people by the British, by the French. But if you learn about what happened after the Underground Railroad, which in Canadian history is kind of like, and they all lived happily ever after, which is not true, of course. But if you learn about it, you learn about how many Indigenous communities were part of bringing Black people into their territories, welcoming them. I'm not going to say it was all benevolent and positive, but there were a lot of relations going back even then between enslaved or freed Black people and Indigenous peoples living in places like Southern Ontario and in Quebec. So there's a lot of interplay. So I think that's important. I think it's important to understand that it's not like one group looking at another group. And in the same way, like when I talk about pride for an entire chapter in this book and talk about BLMTO's very historic disruption of pride in 2016, the thing that was wrong with that was that people saw it through this lens of like, well, why are the Black people interrupting the gay people stuff?
Right.
Why are Black people taking over a queer space when it's like they should understand that queer people have their struggles too? And they should be respectful of that, when of course that just erases all Black queer people. It erases the efforts that I try to talk about in the book of Black, queer, and trans people fighting queer liberation struggles for a really long time and being pushed out and erased from those struggles in favor of a kind of like more white, homogenous idea of being queer, identifying as LGBTQ in this society, right? So that's the long way of saying that these things are all connected. And in fact, it really is in the tradition that I'm following by writing this book. A lot of Black, queer, especially feminist scholars who have put all of these things together and said we can't actually look at them as being separate. And I'm talking about the recently departed Bell Hooks, the very first person that I cite in my book, and a number of other scholars and thinkers that I could go through, many of whom are writing and living in this country, including Christina Sharpe, Dionne Brand, Idil Abdillahi, L. Jones, Nourbese Philip, Rinaldo WIlcot, Catherine McKittrick. Like, we could go on and on and on. Putting these things together and making sure that we realize that they are together is really important. And I think it's about solidarity too, which is the last thing I'll say about this, is that like, if I don't relate to somebody else's struggle, my ability to build power with them depends on me being like, I might not experience what you go through,
right,
but I want to fight alongside you and in partnership with you, in solidarity with you as you fight for what you're trying to do. Let's lift each other up by hearing and listening to each other's struggles. And like, this is the big problem today with liberal people complaining that race is tearing us all apart. Apparently race brought us all together for one moment when Dr. King was alive like 60 years ago. And now the same idea is that race now tears us apart because all the race projects are finished. We're done with all that. We made everything equal. So what the hell are they still complaining about? Well, actually, you don't have to be racialized to understand that our struggle is part of a broader emancipatory struggle. You don't have to be Black to understand that the Black struggle is part of a larger liberatory struggle. And you can learn and uplift and exchange and share with other people who are organizing around different things and make your struggle bigger. There's no, this garbage that we hear so much about, you have to focus less on race, for example, and more on class. These aren't real. Like, all these struggles are interconnected to one another.
Your chapter on pride was so helpful for those who aren't aware of that history. I mean, going back to Stonewall, and then Toronto's history with the bathhouse raids, and how the Black community was part of that movement from the get-go. Like, without having that history, what happened with the Pride Parade did seem out of the blue for many straight white observers. So I guess one question I have for you is, those stories don't come across well in sound bites, right? Mm-hmm. How do you, I mean, for those of us who have read your book, and I really, again, encourage all of you to, and I'm going to send you all an email tomorrow with a link and a reminder to get the book. What are your thoughts these days about how you can use other platforms like radio, like newspapers? You've had so many different, you've worn so many hats as a communicator, right? You're prolific on Twitter. You've now written a book. Your experience with the media, very publicly, was bittersweet with the Star. Just, I'd love for you to share some thoughts, just because as an organizer, and I'm sure a lot of others watching, I mean, we're always thinking about how do we reach a mass audience with complex ideas that can't always be condensed into a tweet or a soundbite. And how do we reach people who aren't going to take the time to read a book?
Wow. I mean, when you say that a lot of these stories and ideas cannot be condensed into sound bites. I wonder what can be, right? So I'm very interested in this argument that being able to communicate politically is very much about how you pitch your message, how we almost sometimes put it into this frame of it is a commodity, it is a product. And of course, like, this is my biggest critique about the mainstream media, is that it's a corporate media. So it's trying to sell you something. So I think the bigger question is, like, how do we communicate with people when we're not just trying to sell them something, which can be done on any story in a 30-second soundbite, right? Like, and how do we have a deeper conversation? I always favored being able to, for example, write in publications where they don't limit your words. I've had many experiences in mainstream media where a publication that is online will say, we only want you to write 1,000 words. And you're like, but why? It's digital. Like, you can have as much space as you want. It doesn't cost you more to put more words on the digital page.
Right.
So why do you care? And their argument is always a kind of permutation of, well, you know, people don't read more than it's 1,000 words. We've noticed that if people get to 1,000-word piece, like, beyond that, they don't really want to read it. That has not been my experience, miss. My experience has been that if you cultivate an audience, they will read it. If you make something that's new or interesting or intriguing or well-written or well-researched, that even if it's long, people actually will read it. But there is an obsession in corporate media with appealing to as many people as possible. It's not about cultivating an audience. It's not about the kind of conversation that I hope we're having here. We're talking to a smaller group of people who might be more like-minded, who might already be thinking about these things, because I actually think that's part of it, right? It's actually not about trying to reach everybody who's out there. It's about cultivating something that will draw people into you. So mass communication on a grand scale to everybody about, like, complex issues of race, no, not interested, probably not realistic, not even maybe fruitful. I certainly don't want to spend my time, for example, arguing with people who don't think that the approach that I am taking is correct. I will say that that doesn't mean that there's no place for debate and critique and disagreement. I value those things very much. But I think that, for example, if I believe that we need to abolish the police, and you think that the police must be kept under all circumstances and must actually maybe even build up on their budget and their arms and their power, I'm not going to spend the next 30 years trying to soundbite you over to my side. You know, and I think that that approach makes perfect sense when you're in the mainstream, because the more people who even click on you a few times, the more that you can convince an advertiser to pay you for ads to get you money, which is the purpose of our corporate media.
Right.
So I think being independent media gives you an opportunity to escape that. A book is a long form as well. A book requires a lot of work and dedication to write as well as to read. But that's what I'm more interested in, because this is a lifelong struggle. It's not a sales pitch. I wouldn't even know what I would do tomorrow if, like, more people maybe were thinking about some of these ideas in the same way as me. Like, maybe we would be building something politically that we could, I know we want to talk about democracy this evening, and maybe we would be able to build something politically that's more productive than what we have today. But certainly, like, I don't just hope that tomorrow hundreds of thousands of people are listening to me so that I have a chance to, like, pitch them on something, because then the next day when they realize that I'm about, like, abolishing police and prisons and, like, you know, destroying the capitalist imperial systems that we live under, they might be like, yeah, but I don't want to do all those things. I just like that one cool thing that you said, right? Like, do you know what I mean? And so I am very wary of the pitch in any ideological context, because when you're only just giving people nice sound bites, you can probably convince them about almost anything.
So in the past 5 years, I mean, you're probably one of the very few people who could say that you've had a radio show, a column, a book, and frequently used a megaphone in front of crowds. I mean, those are four like really different platforms. What are you using now? The Star, I mean, I don't know if everyone here knows the story of what happened with Des at the Toronto Star. I don't know if you want to encapsulate it, or I could summarize it. I think
it's in the book. It's in the book.
It's in the book.
Finish what you're saying and I will summarize.
I'm just wondering where you're at now. I mean, you were unceremoniously deposed from one of those platforms. Are you eager to write a second book? What are your thoughts on radio? What are your thoughts about more independent crowdfunded media like Canada Land? Like, what excites you right now in terms of platforms for you to get thoughtful, meaningful messages out in a way that resonates with you as a leader?
Well, as a leader of like my own kind of media thingy.
I knew you wouldn't like that word. As a human.
For those who, the Toronto Star is one very dramatic chapter in my more than a decade now of navigating Canadian media. It's a very dramatic chapter because it involves them courting me to come and be a part of their publication using they put my face. I don't know if they even it's so funny. I found it the other day. In fact, I found an old copy of it. The day that I premiered as a columnist at the Toronto Star, they put my face on the front page of the newspaper at the little top banner announcing that I was a new columnist, which is interesting because I wasn't a full-time columnist with them at that time. And I never became a full-time columnist at the Star. But, this is how our institutions take advantage of race, but while undercutting Black and other racialized people, is that they're selling you something by putting Desmond's face on the front page and, oh, look, we've got this new columnist who isn't even full-time, who has to invoice for all of his pieces. But it's very exciting for us as the Toronto Star. And, within less than a year, I was kind of called in by John Hondrick, the acting publisher at the time and the former chair of the board. And he was just like, you're writing about race too often. Interestingly, John Hondrick denies this now because he didn't think that I would tell on him. He thought that he could take me out for a fancy dinner, which he did. He doesn't dispute anything else, by the way, in my story. He only disputes that he said, you're writing about race too often, as if that's the first time a white person in media has ever told me that. Like, he's not even original, but pretending that that he didn't say it once I exposed that publicly. But that happened 8 months into my tenure at the Star, and I stayed there in total for about a year and a half. So I worked for another 8 or 9 months before ever disclosing that had happened to me. But it all came to a head when I participated in a demonstration. And the Toronto Star said that me participating in this demonstration was against the rules of their publication. I never signed a contract saying I would never engage in a demonstration. And so that was not any agreement that I had with the Toronto Star. Toronto Star has very famously hired many people who are activists to write in their pages, and they've never told any of those people that they have to stop engaging in activism for the privilege of writing in the Toronto Star. So they applied that rule selectively to me because my particular Black liberation kind of fight was embarrassing to them. It wasn't embarrassing to put my face on the front page and advertise me in that way. But when I actually did the things in real life that they were trying to sell as an image and a gimmick, then they were very embarrassed. And that resulted in me quitting because I was tired of being controlled at the Toronto Star. I have spent, I can't believe it, but at the end of this month, January 29th, I guess, 28th, will be the 2-year anniversary of this book being published, of The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power being published. And everybody knows this is the strangest 2 years that most of us have ever experienced. So it doesn't even feel like that's what's just happened. It's very strange. But I have spent so much time in the last little while just promoting this work that I spent the better part of 5 years working on. And so things like this talk that I've been doing for the last 2 years, this has been like the major platform, and I just trying to promote the book that I spent so much time working on. I don't even tweet as much as I used to, even though I think it's so funny. When you have a lot of followers on Twitter, it amplifies, I think, people's view of how much you're even saying. Half of what I tweet are like pictures of birds and flowers and stuff. So I'm not saying as much on that medium as I used to. I have a kind of online digital publication with a friend of mine, Elle Jones, called Yes Everything, where I've been occasionally publishing different things. I published a pretty major piece about anti-Palestinian sentiment at the Toronto District School Board in like early October. And I published that after I was invited to the TDSB to be a speaker there. And because I expressed support for Palestinian people in their struggle, the school board became extremely uncomfortable. And there was this like big backlash against me for doing that. I think it's important for me to say that in the entire time that I've been doing everything you said, Mez, 5 years on live radio on the largest AM network in Canada, a Toronto Star column that got a lot of attention over a year and a half, a best-selling book, all kinds of TV and radio interviews, podcasts. I've still never had a job in mainstream Canadian media, a full-time job, not one. And I don't know that I ever will, because I don't really think anybody wants to take a chance on having somebody with my politics under their banner, because the corporate media that we operate under wants to pretend that it doesn't have a politics, but it's like really, really good at excluding the kind of politics that people like me espouse. Like what we call the left in Canada, especially in like the political spectrum, like the NDP is like the farthest left that people can think of in this country. That's a joke. And so once you go beyond that, you're not really going to get a hearing in mainstream political conversation or in media conversation. And yet I'm somehow out here surviving. I feel very blessed. I've worked for it. I'm going to keep being independent in whatever I do next. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to be. It's crazy because I won't say too much about this tonight, but I even have applied recently for a couple of mainstream jobs. And I haven't done that even in a long time, because I've just been thinking like, what's the point? Everybody knows I'm out here. I'm doing work that a lot of people are talking about, but I don't get approached. You know that if you're doing something that people want, they will approach you and they will ask you to come and be a part of their team. And I think I've proven that I know how to have success in Canadian media, but I'm tired of feeling like I have to prove myself. And so I kind of lay in the cut and I do my own thing these days. And I am looking forward to expanding Yes Everything with Elle Jones and doing more podcasting, more video interviews. This is my apartment, but I'm hoping to maybe this year set it up more like a studio to do some more videos and interviews. And I was like, when I was doing radio at News Talk 1010, I really enjoyed having at least one place for 5 years where every week I could talk about whatever news stuff I wanted to. I could take clips from things and discuss them, and I could have guests on, and it was like a refuge. And I really am realizing that after a couple of years of touring this book, I'm really missing doing a lot of that day-to-day, week-to-week kind of stuff. So I'm just trying to think about that, but I'm not rushing anything. I just feel so blessed to have this book out into the world and to have people talking about it.
Nice. Activist tactics. So there's, this is like a two-part question. There's always a dilemma, I think, for anyone who's trying to bring about change of to what degree do you bite your tongue in order to preserve relationships? And to what degree do you say what you're actually feeling, even though it might burn a bridge? I think you tend to lean more towards the second category in a way that I find really inspiring. It makes you come across to me as just incredibly authentic, which is rare in any kind of politics. And you have, probably lost relationships over it, or created tension or headaches or closed employment opportunities, but no one can ever accuse you of, biting your tongue because you were trying to climb some ladder. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, but I'm actually more interested in another area where you've kind of worn different hats, if you could say, or performed different roles, is the question of like working on the inside or working on the outside. The kind of cliche of, do we want to be at the table or in the streets? And you've done both also very well. So you have some really great stories in the book where communities have come together to fight for change against the odds, against a dominant culture, against elites, and won. And sometimes the moment of victory is at a meeting where you came into the meeting and you spoke at the meeting and you had allies in the meeting. Let's say the Toronto District School Board voting against having police in schools. And that was kind of like, we're going to go in there, infiltrate the system. We're going to win a vote by pulling all the levers we can. But then you've also got stories where you prevented someone from being deported because you were willing to just block traffic and just like be a shit disturber. And both of those stories are in the book, and you've effectively used both of those methods. I'm just curious where you're at, where your thoughts are. Do you see yourself 10 years from now winning a vote in a legislature or a council chamber because you were counting your votes and you were lobbying? Or do you see yourself winning victories because you helped inspire a movement to like shut down a highway? Or is it both all the time? Are both equally important? And of course, the last part of the question, and someone's already mentioned it by asking if you want to run for mayor as a full-time job. Obviously, I'm sure you've been approached by parties, perhaps, maybe not. But surely you've thought of, well, you have run. You ran for city council many years back. And you talk in the book with equal admiration, I think. Maybe not equal, but there's parts in the book where you point out politicians who have, as rare as it is, exercised true allyship. Just where are you at in terms of where you see your energy and your resources going politically to make change happen, especially as you get older?
There's a lot in there. So
yeah, go.
Let me see. First of all, when you talk about how you said something at the beginning about how I've been able to be successful in like some of these mainstream spaces, or that it's like it's rare to hear this. And I think it goes back to what I was just saying, which is that like the mainstream doesn't want to talk about many of the things that myself and many other people are interested in. As an example of this, in 1963, so we're talking about almost 60 years ago now, Austin Clarke, the late journalist and then novelist and incredible writer, poet, Austin Clarke wrote a piece for Maclean's, and it was about his experience immigrating here from Barbados and trying to adapt to a racist white society in Canada. And he wrote this piece and he submitted it to Maclean's, and they put a headline on it calling it Canada's angriest Black man. Now, when Maclean's did this to Austin Clarke 60 years ago, they were trying to suggest that his view was somehow like exceptional and weird. It wasn't weird or exceptional, but it was just a view that they didn't want to include in mainstream conversation. So they sensationalized it, right? And I think that that's what happens with so many people who try to step into these spaces. And we see so many people, and I mentioned like Nourbese Philip earlier. I can think of even like in contemporary times, so many people whose conversations about their Blackness have just been unwanted. These are not like weird fringe positions. They're just ones that like fall out of this Canadian political spectrum where like the most left you can go is like white Labor New Democrats. And that's like, you know, Leninist thought in Canada or something. It's like quite funny, you know, like this is like far radical left kind of thinking if you're like part of the NDP now. So that by its nature excludes so many of us at the get-go and makes it seem like we're promoting something that's strange or that only we have like the courage or whatever to say, when really people are just always sacrificing their careers, always being left out by virtue of the fact that they refuse, you know what I'm saying? To compromise so that they can get into these places of institution. Right. So it is on the shoulders, if you will, as the expression goes, of those people that I am standing who made it possible. But I think now to go into the other part of what you're asking about, there always seems to be this temptation, this seduction that says you keep doing that ad infinitum. You just keep capitulating your real values, you hide them, you flower them up, and then you get into the institution because that's where you can make the real change. It's not true. That's how you leave people behind. That's exactly how you leave people behind because, for example, when you are willing to be part of a publication that, as the Toronto Star did, and as I talk about in the book, if you're willing to be part of a publication that will do all this background research and investigation into something like racist policing, you know, carding in the city of Toronto, and they'll do all this great investigating and background work and dig up all of the statistics on it. But then when it comes time to say, therefore, we need to dismantle the system of policing that keeps doing these racist things to people. Oh, no, my goodness, no. No, we need to play within the system and we need to find writers, even if they want to criticize that system, who are still willing to recommend remedies within it. And this is exactly why Canadian media continues to be so white, why all of the people who make decisions in Canadian media are from the same families and from the same social circles as they were 50 years ago. This is exactly the reason why, because they don't want to hear it. And they're going to make a professional penalty for anybody who tries. And that means that even incredibly talented people who have more socialist views or who have anti-imperialist views, they won't even try, right? They'll just know from the get-go. For example, I remember, you know, I mentioned that I expressed solidarity with, you know, Palestinian struggle, Palestinian liberation struggle at the Toronto District School Board in September, and there was a big backlash. When I went to News Talk 1010 5 years ago, I was talking to my producer, and my producer told me, whatever you do while you're here, don't talk about that conflict between Israel and Palestine. You can talk about anything you want to, but don't talk about Israel and Palestine because people will get angry with you and you'll probably not be around here for very long. So we already have limitations that are built into the system that you just won't even get in the door.
Right.
But I don't believe that then the right approach to answer that is to censor yourself and then pretend that once you get in the good favor of people who are putting those limitations on, that then you'll be able to actually do something worthwhile. I found ways to talk about Israel and Palestine even when I was told not to, when I had that radio show, because that's what I believe in. And I don't actually think people are, because I heard pro-Israel sentiment on that radio station all the time. And so I didn't really even think it was a big deal. Like, our prime minister is talking about Israel, our government is weighing in on boycott, divestment, and sanctions and saying whether it's good or bad. Why would we not talk about it when our government leaders who we elect talk about it? Like, it's you have to push back against the limitations of the system so that the next people coming in can have a broader discussion than you were allowed to have. The idea that you can get into the institution, hide away, get into everybody's good book, and then convince them against the thing that they're creating their club around. Like, we're going to create a club for these kind of political ideas and values, but if you hang around with us long enough, you can maybe trick us into betraying our club. Of course not. That's not going to work. It has never worked. It is naive to think that it's going to. I have had to learn that the hard way through a lot of years of believing that maybe there was a way to operate ethically within, for example, the corporate media, operate in a way where, yeah, you can do both of those things. You can have your values, but you can also have this platform. I don't believe that anymore. And I also just think, like, you can't convince a corporate interest to work against its own project. So we're not going to convince Rogers and Bell Canada to think in a way that is going to, like, bring about the anti-capitalist revolution that I want. They're on the wrong side of that revolution, and we will be fighting them, and we are fighting them, and we will continue to fight them. They are part of the problem.
Where does the CBC fit in for you?
I suppose I ought to mention, for those who are familiar with it, a recent piece by a former CBC employee named Tara Henley, who resigned and then wrote this piece saying that the CBC has succumbed to a radical left ideology. What a joke. What an absolute joke, when, not so long ago, Wendy Mesley was being protected by the CBC after using multiple times the N-word at work. And she's shielded and protected. And the people who speak out about that kind of behavior, they never move up at the CBC. People like Amar Khan are dismissed from the CBC, right? For having an opinion about racist old Don Cherry. And he tweeted his opinion about Don Cherry and lost his job. And yet we're being told that the CBC is this kind of like bastion of leftism. Again, if your idea is that, like, the NDP constitutes the radical left in Canada, like, I don't know, like, this is a place that destroys Black and Indigenous and disabled and racialized people's dreams and careers, where we never even get to say the things that we want, where we can't even be protected from everyday workplace abuses. But somehow the narrative is that CBC is too left-wing. The CBC doesn't have the same corporate mandate as Rogers or Bell or the others, but or Global, right? But it's still a corporation. It's just a publicly funded corporation, and it is advancing the interests of corporate Canada in the exact same way as the other corporations are. It's advancing, like, settler colonial norms the same way. Of course, it could be so much more, and we wish that it was. A lot of people do a lot of amazing work at CBC. But its problem is that it is just as much married to institutional power as any corporation. So I say the same thing. Despite the fact that there's a lot of awesome people doing amazing stuff at CBC, it's not like one day the CBC is going to be serving, like, the most marginalized and excluded people in our society, to the exclusion of corporate power, to the exclusion of government power. CBC wants to be close to power. They want to have shows where leading political figures come on and grace us all with their presence, right? They don't want to go into communities or jails or shelters. And I'm not saying they never cover those stories, but I'm saying what matters to CBC. Like wait till Queen Elizabeth finally dies, and then we're going to see like the CBC at its like fullest, is that like this monarch who means more to this country than most of the people who live here. And I've seen like CBC reports about like the Queen canceling her plans during COVID recently, and the Queen had to divert. Like that's who they're interested in telling stories about. It doesn't mean they won't tell stories about anybody else, but you can tell what matters to these institutions, and it is power from on high, not the power of the people.
Let's go back to electoral politics for a second. So we're in 2022 now. There'll be a provincial election in the spring, municipal elections all across the province in October. Is this on your radar at all? Do you feel like the movement work almost happens external to the election cycle to the point where it disinterests you? Do you think about running at any level of government? Are there any candidates who excite you, who you want to support? Do you see it as a valuable platform to advance ideas or not?
No, it is not. So let's take the provincial election coming in June.
Yeah.
I think that anything that I could say about Doug Ford, I could probably say about anyone else who would be in his position. If Andrea Horwath had become the premier in 2018, she became opposition instead. But had she won, I believe that we would be facing a lot of the same crises that we're facing now, because the political spectrum is so narrow and the possibilities for what government is really expected to do are so narrow that I think most people in power tend to move towards the same things. The difference is in their tone and in their communications. So the NDP would never be as outwardly harsh to some groups as the Conservatives would be. But I feel like a lot of the policy decisions are the same. Now, the thing is, do I have a preference? Sure. Of course, I don't. I mean, I would like anybody more than I would like Doug Ford to be in power. But I've been asked to run many times for political parties, for the NDP. I mean, the Liberals at least know that I would have nothing to do with them. The NDP should know I would have nothing to do with them, but they keep asking. And I say no every time. And the reason that I say no is because my values don't align. And I don't see people within these parties advancing things and prioritizing things that I care about. What I do see is the exact same approach that you were just mentioning when it comes to media, is like, let us get into power first. Let us play nice. Let us court the white middle class center of Canadian politics. And then don't worry, for example, Black people, when we actually get in, well, of course, you know we love you. You know we're going to do all of these things to help you, but just shut the hell up for a minute and help us get elected. Stop complaining, stop whining. Help us get power, and then maybe we can talk about some of the things that you want. And I for me, that's a non-starter, and it always has been. I did run for office, but I did so in a municipal race at 24 years of age. I've never run for a political party, and God help me, I never will. When you ask about working inside versus outside, and that cliched question that anybody in any public sphere is going to be asked after a while about like political stuff anyway, I think a better question is, what's our goal? Right? Is our goal incrementalism? So the idea that we can make things a little bit better for people maybe coming after us than we found them? Or is our goal to advance the most like genuine version of a politics that we want and fight for that at all costs, right? Because you can get into any institution that you want to. You can get into government if you want to. If you're always telling people who are suffering, not now, not now, not now, not yet. It's not practical to help you yet. It's not the right political climate to help you yet. We don't have enough money to help you yet. I think you're doing a disservice. And really, like, the cheapening of life is maybe no more evident for me than it is right now during COVID-19, where all of our political decisions are based on whether or not people are going to die of COVID and whether or not we can prove that they died of COVID. And what I mean by this is that we worry now about hospitalizations due to COVID. And that's like now the big new metric. First it was cases, but now there are so many cases that we can't count them. So now the new metric is, well, do we know people are actually really getting sick? Because we have to downplay how bad COVID is. And if people aren't dying in the ICU of COVID-19, if they're not coming in, hacking and unable to breathe, and then subsequently dying of that disease, well, then everything is going to be fine. And we shouldn't actually act to protect people, because dying is the threshold. Once people start dying, then we know something bad is happening. But if they're not dying, well, then we're fine. And so we have a healthcare system and a provincial emergency response system that tells disabled people, that tells immunocompromised people, that tells people who cannot get vaccinated, well, sorry, later. You know, we can't take care of you right now. We've got to get the economy running again. We've got to get businesses and restaurants open again. And if you're dying, come back to us and then we'll see what we can do to help you. And I think this is the limitation of pragmatic politics, is that when you actually have an emergency and you have a crisis, we don't act like the way that you would think that we would in an emergency. You would think that in an emergency, we would drop everything and just say, how do we support and care for people? And that is not what has happened in Canada in the last 2 years. The elderly have suffered the largest in terms of dying. And that's been okay for the Canadian population at large, because we're told not to value people as they age. And so that kind of dying is acceptable. Exposing disabled and immunocompromised people to this virus is seen as being more acceptable, because we have to make some sacrifices and we have to make some, and this is why you have to fight for what you want politically. Because if this is really a fight to the death, some of us can't actually wait for that convenient moment to be cared for, to be treated with dignity, to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged for our pain and our suffering. Some of us cannot wait until it is a convenient time for the system. We are dying. We are losing our health. How many people are going to have long-term effects of COVID from the rest of their life who don't die? Right. And then the same system that didn't protect them is going to be saying in 20 or 30 years that we have to move towards more privatization now, because there's just such a strain on our healthcare system. So many people are sick, but the same system allowed those people to get sick because it wanted to make sure that Walmart was open again, right? And so capitulating, right? And asking only for what we think we can get in the moment politically is a long-term strategy, I think, for failure. And yeah, it does take courage. But as I was saying before, so many people are left out of the conversation altogether because they insist on fighting from the margins.
What about using elections just as an opportunity to get a message out, not trying to win, but running? I'll tell you, this is a question from Madeline and Jacob. Can you speak about the idea of running, is it possible to run for office in a revolutionary, intersectional, democratic way?
Nope. Short answer, no. But let's talk about it more. My short answer is no, but there is a kind of, I think, mainstream political engagement that I could get on board with. I don't see it anywhere in any mass way. And so what I would like would be that, because so many issues have been exposed, again, and I want to take the province and I want to take COVID, because I think that any fair understanding of this year's election would be thinking about what we have learned in the last 2 years politically and trying never to repeat the disasters and failures that we've had ever again. For whatever good that people think has happened, and there has been some good things that have been done and some good management and supports, but we want to focus on the things that we didn't get right and prevent them from happening again. So what could some of those things that have been really, I think, exposed for all of us be? They would be, I think, childcare, which we are one of the last holdout provinces in Ontario to have signed a childcare agreement at this time. Yeah. It would be sick leave, and the fact that most people don't have adequate sick leave and therefore can't protect themselves from something like COVID-19 or any other health emergency without risking losing their job, losing their home, like losing their savings that they may have, right? So sick leave, like we've seen during this pandemic, critically important. We've seen that the lack of any guaranteed income that is stable for people is a disaster, because people who were seen as being valuable to the economy got $2,000, but if you're on Ontario disability, you're getting less than that. So we're saying that you are more valuable to Ontario because you worked at some point in the recent past, but if you didn't work, you are less valuable and you need less emergency support.
Right.
So that should never happen ever again, and welfare on disability rates should be dramatically revisited. But is the party that is seen as being the far left party that has a chance politically, are they going to be fighting vigorously for these things that I'm talking about, Mez? I don't think that they are. And I don't think that they have to, because they are not afraid of a mass movement of ordinary people who are going to create a political alternative if they don't. Right. So they campaign in the center, they govern from the center or even center right. And all of these labor issues that I'm talking about, and issues of, again, people being pushed to the margins, they aren't going to be represented politically. And we have to do more work so that when there's an election in the future, politicians are terrified of this mass mobilization of people fighting for exactly these issues, but we aren't there yet. And there's going to have to be so much work done, but that's the kind of work I'm interested more than,
right.
Because let's just be real, okay? Let's say that somebody was getting close to having power in a municipal or in a provincial context in Canada, who was like, we need to abolish policing as it currently exists. Do you think that that person would like physically be safe while they were in office? Do you think that it is possible in Canada right now to have real political power and not have people be like, I'd like to actually harm that person because they want to dismantle the police? Even if you get in as one individual, say on a city council, you will be outnumbered by people who think that your ideas are harmful and dangerous, and you won't be able to make a lot of political progress. I still wish that we had some of that, but I mean, I'm basically wishing for a world that doesn't and can't exist right now, because I'm asking people who aren't affected by these things in their day-to-day and who don't feel strongly to fight for them, I'm asking them to go do that so that those of us who are most vulnerable really don't have to. Like, I don't think that Black people in 2022 in the ones and twos that they're going to push for these issues should have to face the backlash inside their own party, from outside their own party, from the media. Like, it's not actually fair to us that we should have to carry all of that burden for so little political involvement and payoff. And I want to be concrete about this. In 2018, Andrea Horwath promised that carding was going to be eliminated if she was able to win the election. That was one of her promises, and that was one of the ways that she tried to court Black community support, is by saying carding is horrible. We've heard about it. The province promised to do something and they didn't, and it's still with us. And if I win, I'm going to get rid of it. You don't even hear Andrea Horwath talking about carding anymore. And when the next election comes along this spring and summer, I think it's going to be a non-issue. Why? Because she's focused on winning, and winning does not involve elevating what she and her party think is a Black people issue to the top of the agenda.
Very similar to the Safe Streets Act, which was brought in under Mike Harris, but is still there in many ways, or at least some of those mechanisms are still there.
Aggressive solicitation. So you can be arrested for begging for money in the street because of the Safe Streets Act. You can be arrested for solicitation near a bank machine. You can be arrested also under like similar vagrancy and provincial bylaws for pissing outside. We've had a pandemic for 2 years where restaurants closed their doors. So you can't go in and use the washroom. And there's at the same time bylaws saying you can't go to the washroom outside. We have people sleeping in public parks, and those same bylaws are in effect. But you talk to the most so-called progressive councillors in the city of Toronto. Do any of them propose repealing bylaws to allow people to sleep outside in a park, to allow people to go to the washroom without getting arrested, to allow people to pitch a tent or start a fire in a barrel? Or not that these are adequate solutions. I'm not saying relieving yourself in the alleyway or pitching a tent in a park is the way that we aim for people to live. But punishing them because they are forced to live like that, like removing even that little barrier is like the absolute minimum demand of a political system. Who at Toronto City Council, in the 2 years of human carnage that we've been seeing out in our parks, in our ravines, to add to the 20 to 30 years of a housing crisis in this city, what so-called progressive politician is like repeal the bylaws? Bare minimum of relief of suffering of people, bare minimum, not one of them. So no, I don't believe that there is a way to do it, because you need to build something politically that doesn't exist yet before that's possible. And it's putting that in place that I believe comes before getting electoral success and electoral movement. Every now and again, when something goes on, we have a little window and a moment to push something a little bit. I believe in doing that. I believe in, of course, there'll be a handful of candidates as individuals for political parties that I'll think, oh, that person's awesome. I support that person. I'd like to help that person out. That's always the case. But politics doesn't work on that individual level. It doesn't work because there's a few people within the larger political system that we think have some great ideas, especially when none of them ever have power. Andrea Horwath has been the leader of the NDP in Ontario for this is her 13th year now. And before her, Howard Hampton was the leader for 15 years. So in my entire adult life, there's been two leaders of the provincial party in my province, of the party that is supposed to be the most left-wing party that has a chance to win. You can tell me that I'm engaging in a futile pursuit by saying I have no time for that and we should be building elsewhere, but I just don't see where we're getting with that. I don't see where we're getting at all.
I think we're very aligned on that. I think change happens when movements build and then the politicians take all the credit in the end. But sometimes it seems it doesn't even matter who's in office. They just catch up to where public opinion has shifted because people were organizing on the ground. That said, I think elections serve a role where a lot of people who don't pay attention to politics might be thinking about policy issues, and it can be an opportunity for policy ideas to be more debated and be moved forward. So I want to bring this back to two specific reforms.
Okay, wait. Can you keep them in your mind? Don't forget them.
I won't.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on that point, that the problem with trying to use the election as the time to raise all of these like issues that we want to talk about is that then they come with promises that politicians have absolutely no intention of keeping. So I don't want them to talk to me about the issues that I care about when they want something in return. I want them to have proven through their actions on a regular basis that they are fighting for those issues. And that's exactly why when mainstream politicians outside of elections won't say repeal the bylaws for vagrancy of people sleeping outside, won't say abolish the police, except for maybe one time in one motion. And then, so again, let's talk about Toronto City Council. I want to be concrete. Josh Matlow and Kristen Wong-Tam put forward a proposal 2 years ago saying that they wanted to defund the Toronto Police by 10% out of the budget that they had at that time.
Right.
And this was seen as incredibly radical proposal. So why is it that as I have watched police officers by the hundreds clear people out of parks with nowhere else to go, how come those same politicians that said defund the police in 2020 have not come back out in 2021 and 2022 and said, you see this horrendous police activity? This is exactly why we need to defund the police. Why haven't they done that? Because they don't actually believe in it. They were using that opportunity to sell back to us later, but on the day-to-day, they are not pushing for that. They are more interested in property owning residents who call their constituency offices and complain, hey, there's a guy sleeping in the park. Hey, they're putting tents in the park again. They're pissing outside. There's violence. Call the police, get security. These are the everyday preoccupations of a city councillor. So the fact that they might every now and again throw us a bone, especially around an election time, no, that's a distraction. And we have to make it so that there is no option for them to respond to a mass movement of people who are consistently fighting for these things. And you know what? It is as exhausting as it sounds. And I'm sure sometimes people wonder, well, how do you sustain something like that over even a short period of time? This is called fighting for your life, though. So people who are advocating for themselves as they sleep in parks, as they are in our shelter system, as they're in the completely inadequate hotel system in Toronto right now that is full of COVID outbreaks, and our shelters are full of COVID outbreaks. It's actually people who are like living those conditions who are also fighting and resisting and pushing back because they don't have the opportunity to take a day off. And again, until we realize that like that's people's everyday reality and that it's not just like, well, what part of the constituency do I want to kind of score some points with today? It's going to be hard to build a bigger movement because some of us can't stop fighting because we're living.
So 2 reforms I want to touch on that I think tie into what you're talking about. Just to bring this back to what Unlock Democracy Canada is doing as a group, trying to implement reforms that would make it easier for movements to create change, easier to by having a political system that has more voices in it, is more responsive to voices, more inclusive of voices. So 2 reforms I want to throw out there, just get your thoughts on them. The first, of course, is proportional representation. Myself and many of my colleagues feel that if we had a proportional model, which is the normal voting system of most Western democracies, we wouldn't be stuck with 3 prehistoric parties. We wouldn't have to choose between orange, blue, and red. There would be 10 parties. There would be 10 parties in the legislature, probably 30 parties on the ballot. You would have a much broader spectrum on the right and the left. And you could start your own party and actually win seats for better or worse. So I want to get your feedback on that. And then the second one I want to hear you talk about, because I know you've advocated for this and been one of the main organizers for it in Canada about 10 years ago, is extending voting rights to non-citizens. It's mathematically logical that politicians ignore the most marginalized communities when we have literally ensured that those communities aren't able to vote. I think it would make a huge difference if hundreds of thousands of non-citizens were given the right to express themselves at the ballot box, and it might help increase the conditions required for movements to be more effective in the political landscape.
I think we should not overestimate what such reforms could do if we implemented them. Like, they are not a panacea, and I know you're not saying that they are. So I think that there's some good in each of them, and that we should also be realistic about the limitations of them. So first one is proportional representation.
Yeah.
It's obvious. Like, our system is like, I no longer tell people to go out and vote. I just don't do it anymore. And one thing that fascinates me about media norms and practices is that you ever watch TV around an election and you have the anchor? I saw this actually in the, you remember the debate where the moderator said that Quebec's law, Bill 21, that stops you from expressing yourself religiously, wearing religious symbols and clothing in a public sector capacity. The moderator of a federal debate, an English federal debate, said that that law was discriminatory, and everybody had a big freak out about that for several days. And all of the politicians were pandering to the most racist elements of Quebec politics and saying, what a horrible question to ask. And, this was very frustrating. But I actually think that the most controversial thing that same moderator said during that debate was at the very end, when she said, no matter what, we hope that you vote, we hope that you go out and register. People got angry at the statement that Bill 21 is discriminatory under the idea that the moderator was supposed to be neutral. But telling people to go out and vote is not neutral.
Mm.
Telling people to go out and vote is an endorsement of the system as it currently exists. And that doesn't mean that I think voting is bad or evil. But in the Canadian context, I feel as though our options are very limited. And so I don't put the emphasis on voting that I once did. I completely support proportional representation. There is no question that the system, as it is designed for two parties, the so-called first past the post system, is archaic and consolidates power and makes it virtually impossible for anybody but the two established political parties, the longest established political parties, to win, that being the Liberals and the Conservatives. Yeah. So obviously we need proportional representation like yesterday. I would just say to people, be careful about white-led voting reform movements that tell everybody this is going to be good for people of color, for example. I would say it's very important to avoid doing that, because if you're not advocating for the things that are going to free everybody, it doesn't really matter what political system or structure of voting that you have. It doesn't come magically from getting the system right. You actually have to believe in the things that you want to see changing, and not think that the formula is in the system or in the voting apparatus or any of those things. That is not the case. Permanent resident voting was something that I fought for starting in 2008 with I Vote Toronto campaign, sponsored by the Maytree Foundation. And I worked out of Thorncliffe neighborhood office, worked with some amazing people out there. I learned so much in the 2 years that I did that project officially, and I continued it for some time afterwards. The biggest mistake I made, though, was that it wasn't really my choice. It was a project that Maytree wanted to fund, and they wanted to fund a project that gave the vote locally to permanent residents. And I think we need to give everybody who's in this country the right to vote. Again, I'm not going to be fighting for that in the future, because I think that there are other things that I'd like to turn my attention to that I think are, for me, more pressing. But there shouldn't be exclusions. We shouldn't worry about somebody being a traveler here from another place, a foreigner and an outsider who's going to come in with their foreign opinion and idea, who hasn't been here long enough, who can vote in our election. Yeah, you're here for 6 months visiting the country from abroad. Yeah, go ahead. Here's a ballot. I don't care. Because just like COVID relief, it would have been better to give everybody a monthly allowance and then say claw it back in the tax system afterwards, than to rigorously police who was going to get any money, and then therefore exclude all kinds of people who needed it. And I think the same thing about voting. There isn't going to be some kind of mass voter conspiracy in Canada where all these people who don't have an interest in our country are suddenly going to come in and vote and do all of these things. Everybody should be able to vote at any level. People who have been in jail.
Do you remember from your advocacy back in 2008, I remember back then you had on the tip of your tongue the countries that have already done this, and the cities that have done it municipally. Do you remember those?
Oh my God.
I only say that for those listening who might not realize that this is an actual reform that is happening across the world, and it's kind of weird that there isn't a movement for it right now publicly here.
I mean, here's the problem, is that yes, I did do research during that time of like voting rights for non-citizens really all around the world, and I was very good back then at being able to list off all of the countries. I'll tell you the problem with that approach, though, Mez, is that people only care about white Western countries and what they do. So people don't care if a voting system in Central Africa might deliver a better outcome for people, might elect more women, they just literally do not give a shit. It's the same thing with policing reforms. Like, people will ask you, you want to disarm the police, so can you tell me a jurisdiction where the police have been disarmed? But they don't care if it's not in Western Europe or North America. And by North America, I mean only Canada or the United States. That's where the real world is. And so anything that happens outside of that is not even considered as being an example for people. So I hesitate to do the kind of advocacy that I did back then to say that it's possible, because, like, if voting is so central to people's lives, and this is the problem and the contradiction, right? Is that I no longer believe that voting is like the central vector to social and public participation. But for those who do, how can they justify denying it to anyone? It's a burden is on them to say why you shouldn't be allowed to vote. And the best argument that most people have for why you shouldn't be allowed to vote is that you shouldn't be allowed until we say you are. Like, it is a reductive kind of circular argument that just says the state decides when. So the state decides that if you've been here 15 years, but you don't have the right papers, you can't vote. But if you're born here on the accident of being born here, then you always have the right to vote and you cannot lose it. Like, these are very arbitrary distinctions.
Yeah. And one really important thing that I learned from that campaign of yours was how, like, when we talk about lowering the voting age to 16, that's also an interesting idea about, you know, how there's hundreds of thousands. I forget the number. I calculated it once, but lots of 16 and 17-year-olds who aren't able to vote, but they're evenly distributed all across Canada, whereas non-citizens are often really concentrated in certain municipalities, but also certain neighborhoods, and they become these kind of like unrepresented neighborhoods where no one who lives in an entire tower complex can vote, which is insane. I mean, you're working here, you're sending your kids to school here, you're paying taxes here, you've lived here maybe for years, you're policed by the police here, you go to the daycares here, but you can't vote for any of the people who regulate any of those things.
And so that is said to be a good that protects the actual franchise of people who already have it. It's almost said to be like, your you're maintaining the value of voting for some people by
Diluting.
that. Well, but this
Right.
is like, this is the logic of like the colonial system that we live under, is that things are valuable insofar as you can deny them to people. So the vote is valuable insofar as some people are not allowed to participate in it. And the kind of change that we need, for me, it just goes so far beyond the existing systems that we have. The existing systems that we have are useless. Mez, we say that this is one of the best countries in the world in which to live. And in many ways, I cannot deny that. But the so-called Charter of Rights and Freedoms does not give you the right to have food in Canada. It does not give you the right to have clean water in Canada. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms does not protect you to have like basic personal safety as a person. It says that it does, but when we actually see how the law plays out and for whom it protects, we know that even the like apparently very forward looking and like model for the rest of the world of like a rights-based framework, you don't have the right to eat. You don't have the right to have shelter over your head in a friggin' winter that gets down to like, tonight was one of the nights, you know, the wind chill, it's quite cold this evening and I can feel the cold coming through the walls tonight. And we live in a country that you freeze to death outside, but you don't have the right to housing. You have to prove your value to the capitalist economy in exchange for being allowed to be sheltered from the elements. No change in the voting system, or even who's allowed to vote in the voting system, is going to change things like that. And by the way, it's not up to people who are the most disenfranchised right now to be getting into the voting system to argue that like food and shelter and water are needs or responsibilities that we need to fight for each other. If that is not self-evident at this current time, then we should know why we're in the situation that we're in. We're fighting for the wrong things.
We're almost at an hour and a half. I want to ask you two last questions.
Okay.
I want to thank all of you. There's still like 90 of you watching. This is amazing. Thank you all for your attention. And Desmond, thank you for taking an hour and a half out of your evening to share with everyone.
No, it's my pleasure. And if there are, if people want to stay for a couple of minutes after your last two questions, I can try to answer a couple of questions for those who were so kind to participate and be part of this.
Cool, thanks. Your book covers some really, really heavy topics and a lot of brutal and sad stories of violence and genocide, like really heavy stuff. But you also write in such a playful way that it's impossible to read your book without occasionally bursting out in laughter, because you insert really witty sarcasm and wordplay that is intended to amuse the reader. How do you keep yourself, you will allow yourself to be immersed in topics that can only trigger anger in any reasonable thinking person, yet you somehow do it with a smile and a sense of humor at the same time. And I find that really inspiring. And you even, on one chapter, May, you're like, let's just be human for a second and just stop to smell the flowers. I mean, I think that's the most subversive chapter of the whole book in a way. I would just love to hear about your human approach to what you do and how you keep balanced and sane, and how you have found this way to express yourself in ways that I find really unique and balanced and human. And the second question is very easy. You've got 90 people here listening to you. Is there anything you want to ask them to do or plug into? I know there's some issues really close to your heart around prison reform, police reform. I think you've got a lot of supporters here on the call. I just want to make sure you've got a chance to just do an open, selfless pitch for anything that you would encourage people to do to get involved and to support your work.
That's really kind, on all accounts. Thank you so much, Mez. I really appreciate that. I was gonna say that a lot of the things that I feel like we experience would be funny if they weren't so awful. And I think that that's because like there is a little bit of an absurd quality to our lives. And so maybe that comes out a little bit. I don't know, the sarcasm or the playfulness, maybe that comes out a little bit in my work because I joke about leaving the Toronto Star and people saying, "Oh, how could you leave such a good gig?" And I'm like, guys, I didn't even have dental. Like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, it wasn't as sweet as it looks. Like, just because they play you up doesn't mean that you're being treated like royalty or something. I think it's a natural response to adversity to try and still, we wish we were laughing, we wish we were joking, we would like to be a little bit lighter about things, and we can't lose that even in the struggle of what we're doing. So I try to remember that because it's very easy to be in despair, especially in these last couple of years that we've all experienced, having to speak to each other in ways like this rather than being in a room with one another, for example, as one example. Now, I might not be speaking to people in Ottawa or other places that I know people have joined from this evening had we been in a room together. So I appreciate that part of it as well. But it's been a dark time for many of us over the last couple of years. And so I hope that in some ways that I can also talk about the light, talk about the things that energize us and give us hope. I will say that the work itself is the thing that energizes me. It is his own kind of thing. So it's not that I engage in the work that I do because like maybe one day down the road, there's going to be some great reward for all of us. Like the fighting part is the reward. Like the sometimes like having these breakthrough moments of humanity and seeing other people, when BLMTO hosted Tent City in front of the police station for 2.5 weeks after Andrew Loku was killed and they didn't charge Andrew Doyle, the police officer who killed him. And then BLM held that space in front of the police station for like 17 days. I like met so many people. I was like singing with people. I was like doing all of these creative things with people just to pass the time in front of that police station, to hide out under the rain. One night at like 3 a.m, I was like DJing because we would all take turns like playing music. And when you forget for a minute that you're in front of the Toronto Police Headquarters because you're all dancing in the rain at 3 a.m, you're just like being alive and celebrating the fact that you are still here and that you can resist. And that in and of itself is like something I value up there more than most things. I truly think that that's some of the good stuff. But I have to tell you, like, I wish that I had the wit of somebody like Vicky Mochama, who can talk with so much range about so many topics, or like my friend Kyrell Grant, like people who are so brilliant and talking a lot about like issues that Black people are dealing with every day, but are doing it in a way that is like so much more creative and fun and engaging than I do. I mean, I envy that particular skill. So when it comes to like what I'm doing now and if people can support, how people can support, I would just say if you haven't bought my book, I would really appreciate it if you did, because I worked on it for such a long time that a lot of, thank you for the product placement, I appreciate that, Mez. A a lot of what I've been thinking about for the last several years is there. And I think it's the most comprehensive, I know it's the most comprehensive work that I've done to date. And so I would really encourage people, but, you know, I would also say to people like, beyond just me and what I'm doing, the power of what I have seen in the last couple of years of people getting together, really basic things like food programs for people during COVID to make sure that people have enough to eat, organizing care supports for people who get sick so that people can go bring stuff to their houses so that they don't have to go outside. All the people who've been doing organizing with people who have nothing in terms of housing. Encampment Support Network, Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction, Hamilton Encampment Support Network out in Hamilton. Like, these are just people who see a need in their local community and are like, I have sleeping bags, I have water, I have time where I can go down there and ask people what they want. I heard Elaine Lamb of Sanctuary here in Toronto talking on the radio on Christmas Day about how you don't want to just take food down to homeless people sleeping outside. And this is a very popular thing that people do around Christmas time, especially because you're not even thinking that people don't have a fridge. So you're giving people what you want to give them without consideration for how they'll be able to use it. But when you take the time to go down to the encampment and talk to people and make relationships with people, they might tell you, you know, what I really need is a battery pack. You know, what I really need is a phone card. What I really need is this. And I've been witnessing those kinds of things where I live and in different regions across this country during this pandemic. Mutual aid funds that help people out, these kind of things. And if people are like, you know, all of this stuff that you write about or that you talk about, it seems so big, just remember that everything that I'm talking about is a story that has come to me in my own community, the story that I've had like some kind of access to like around me and that I have chosen to pursue. And that all of us are able to do that in one way or another. All of us are able to engage locally for something that we care about, to start making relationships with people and to try and make a little bit of relief and difference. It is as simple or as hard as that, because sometimes the big picture political stuff can just be outright daunting. And I know all about that. But that's not the only or most important, I think, method of engaging.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we're over an hour and a half. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording.